An experienced pilot faces every commander's worst nightmare: total cabin depressurization at 37,000 feet, with nearly 300 lives depending on every second of his decisions. With oxygen systems progressively failing and time working against everyone on board, he must descend through a storm while fighting his own hypoxia. A desperate race against the clock, where 22 minutes can mean the difference between heroism and tragedy. I watched people passing out around me while the altimeter read 37,000 feet. My own fingers were starting to tingle, my vision blurring at the edges, and I knew I had maybe 3 at most 4 minutes before losing consciousness completely. Behind me, on the other side of that cockpit door, 289 passengers were breathing air that no longer existed, and the only thing between all of them and death was my ability to keep my hands steady on the yoke while my own brain screamed for oxygen. You're in the right place if you want to know what it's like to make the most important decision of your life while literally suffocating. What I'm about to tell you changed forever how I see this profession, and maybe it'll change how you see those who command the machine you trust your life to on every flight. My name is Richard Fernandez, and that June morning, I had 15 years of experience as a Boeing 737-800 captain. More than 12,000 flight hours under my belt, hundreds of landings in adverse conditions, training for every imaginable type of emergency. I considered myself prepared for anything. The quiet arrogance of someone who'd flown so long without ever facing a real emergency. That unshakable confidence you build with years of routine, of procedures executed perfectly, of flights that end exactly as planned. I had no idea I was just 2 hours away from discovering how unprepared I really was. The flight had departed on time at 6:40 in the morning. Domestic route a little over 3 hours to our destination in the southeast. A regular Tuesday. Clear skies on takeoff, calm forecast for almost the entire route. My co-pilot was Daniel, a 28-year-old, competent but still with that freshness of someone who sees magic in every takeoff. I liked flying with him. He reminded me of myself 20 years ago, when every flight was still an adventure and not just another day at the office at 35,000 feet. We crossed the coast, established our flight level at 37,000 feet, configured the autopilot. Everything perfectly normal. I was reviewing some procedures for the approach when I heard it. It wasn't a boom, wasn't an explosion. It was a sound you feel more than hear, a kind of deep and sinister sigh from the fuselage itself, followed by a high-pitched whistle that made every hair on my body stand on end. My ears immediately started hurting with intense pressure, like someone was driving needles into my eardrums. "Depressurization!" Daniel shouted, but I was already reaching for the oxygen mask above my head. The procedure is so ingrained in us it's almost instinctive. First you protect yourself, then you protect the aircraft, then you protect the passengers. Sounds selfish put that way, but it makes perfect sense. You can't save anyone if you're passed out. I put on the mask, tightened the straps, felt the flow of oxygen filling my lungs. Daniel did the same in less than 3 seconds. The panel in front of us was a festival of red lights and audible alarms. The cabin depressurization warning screamed its urgent message. I disconnected the autopilot and took manual control. My first reaction, trained in hundreds of simulations, was to initiate an emergency descent. The rule is clear. In case of depressurization above 10,000 feet, you descend to an altitude where people can breathe without supplemental oxygen, and you descend fast, very fast. Daniel was already giving me the information I needed, checking the instruments, confirming the extent of the problem. This wasn't a slow depressurization, it was an explosive depressurization. The pressure difference between the cabin and the exterior had been equalized in a matter of seconds. That meant there was a large hole somewhere in the fuselage or a catastrophic failure in the pressurization system. Whatever the cause, we had minutes, maybe seconds, before people in the cabin started passing out from lack of oxygen. "Initiating emergency descent," I informed control, pushing the yoke forward and reducing engine power to idle configuration. The nose of the 737 pitched down, and we began falling from the sky at a rate that would make any awake passenger feel their stomach rise to their throat. 5,000 feet per minute. It was as fast as I could descend safely without compromising the aircraft's structure. Still, it would take almost 6 minutes to reach 10,000 feet. 6 minutes is an eternity when you're without oxygen. If you're following this story and want to hear more true tales from the skies, Subscribe to Black Box now. These are stories you won't find anywhere else. That's when I heard Sandra's voice, our cabin chief, on the interphone. And from her tone, I knew the situation was even worse than I'd imagined. "Captain, the passenger oxygen masks didn't drop. I repeat, the masks didn't drop." I felt my blood freeze. Even through the oxygen mask, even with adrenaline coursing through my veins, those words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Passenger oxygen masks are designed to drop automatically when cabin altitude exceeds 14,000 feet. It's a simple mechanical fail-safe system, except when it fails. And now it had failed, with 289 people breathing rarefied air that contained maybe half the oxygen they needed at an altitude where you have less than a minute of useful consciousness. "Sandra, release the masks manually, now," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a procedure for this, an emergency lever the crew can pull to force the release of the masks." But even as I said it, I knew it was already too late for many people. How much time had passed since depressurization? 30 seconds? 40? People would already be feeling the effects of hypoxia, the lack of oxygen to the brain, confusion, dizziness, inappropriate euphoria, loss of motor coordination. "I'm trying, Captain. The lever is jammed. I can't pull it." Impossible. That was literally impossible, but it was happening. In all my years of flying, in all the emergencies I'd trained for, I'd never considered the possibility of a double failure. Depressurization plus total failure of the passenger oxygen system. It was like being struck by lightning while winning the lottery. The odds were astronomical, but they didn't matter now. The impossible was happening and I needed to deal with it. I looked at the altimeter. We were still at 33,000 feet and descending. I did the calculations mentally, at a rate of 5,000 feet per minute. It would take almost 5 minutes to reach 10,000 feet, where the air would be breathable again. 5 minutes. 300 seconds. And at that altitude, people had maybe 60 seconds of useful consciousness before they started passing out. Some would already be unconscious. Children, elderly, anyone with respiratory problems, they'd be the first to fall. "Daniel, check if there's any closer airport below us. Anything where we can land." He was already on the maps, fingers flying over the multifunction panel. "There's a military airport 90 miles to the south, Captain. Runway long enough for us. Request emergency authorization. Tell them we have total depressurization and loss of passenger oxygen system. Tell them we're landing there with or without authorization." It wasn't a request. I had 289 people losing consciousness behind me. Regulations, protocols, authorizations, none of that mattered anymore. My job now was to get that plane on the ground before we started having deaths. Daniel understood that immediately and began coordinating with air traffic control, his voice firm and professional despite the situation. I banked the aircraft south, slightly increasing the descent rate to 5,500 feet per minute. I was pushing the structural limits of the 737, but I had no choice. Every second at high altitude was another second of brains being deprived of oxygen, another second of possible irreversible brain damage, another second closer to death. Sandra's voice came back on the interphone, and this time I could hear the panic barely contained behind the professionalism. "Captain, people are passing out. There are unconscious people in every section of the cabin. I can't assess how many. The flight attendants are trying to help, but they're staggering themselves." I closed my eyes for a brief second, allowing myself a moment of pure desperation before pushing it to the back of my mind. There was no room for emotions now. There were only procedures, decisions, actions. I was the only person on that plane who could save it, and I wasn't going to fail. I wasn't going to let those 289 people die because I panicked. "Sandra, listen carefully. The flight attendants need to put on their own portable oxygen masks immediately. You can't help anyone if you pass out. Then, I want you to prioritize children and elderly. Put the portable masks on them first. Don't try to wake up anyone who's already passed out. The oxygen will bring them back when we descend." "Understood?" "Understood, Captain." I knew I was asking the impossible. The portable masks the flight attendants carry have enough oxygen for maybe 15 minutes. There wouldn't be enough for everyone. Sandra and her team would have to make impossible choices about who would receive oxygen and who would be at the mercy of the descent. But it was all we had. The aircraft shook around me as we cut through the air in our controlled dive. We passed 28,000 feet, then 25,000. My mind was constantly calculating. Time to 10,000 feet. Time people could survive unconscious. Time until permanent brain damage began. All the numbers were bad. All of them told me I wasn't descending fast enough. Captain, military control has authorized our landing. They're clearing traffic and mobilizing medical teams. Daniel's voice brought small relief. At least we'd have help waiting when we landed. If we could land in time. That's when I noticed something that made my heart almost stop. The outside temperature was dropping rapidly as we descended, and we began entering a layer of clouds. Clouds weren't a problem in themselves, but those particular clouds at that altitude with that temperature meant something very specific. They meant ice. Daniel, monitor the ice sensors, now. He checked the instruments, and his voice came a tone higher than normal. We're accumulating ice on the wings, Captain. Moderate rate. Of course we were, because nothing that day could be simple. Ice on the wings alters the aircraft's aerodynamics, increases weight, reduces lift. On a normal flight, we'd activate anti-ice systems and adjust our route to avoid the worst areas of ice formation. But we weren't on a normal flight. We were in an emergency descent, and I couldn't afford to slow down or change course to avoid ice. Every second counted. I activated the 737's anti-ice systems, feeling the engines respond with a slight increase in fuel consumption as hot air was diverted to critical surfaces. But the ice was already forming faster than the systems could remove it. I felt the aircraft get heavier, the response to controls getting slightly slower. These were subtle changes, but after 15 years flying this specific type of aircraft, I knew every nuance of its behavior, and now it was telling me we were in trouble. 20,000 feet, Daniel announced, his voice tense. We'd been descending for just over 3 minutes. Each of those minutes felt like an hour. I wondered how many people were still conscious in the passenger cabin. I wondered if the children I'd seen boarding, excited about their trip, were still breathing. I wondered if I'd be able to live with myself if I couldn't save them in time. Sandra's voice came back, and this time the panic was fully evident. Captain, I have a flight attendant who passed out. His portable mask ran out, and there are more unconscious people than I can count. Please tell me we're almost on the ground. 3 minutes, Sandra. Hold tight for 3 minutes. You're doing an incredible job. But inside I was screaming. 3 minutes was still too long for brains without oxygen, too long for vital organs to start failing. I needed to go faster, but I was already pushing the aircraft to its limits. Going faster would mean risking structural damage, risking losing control completely, and then everyone would die for sure. That's when the hardest decision of my life presented itself to me. I looked at the altimeter, at the descent rate, at the structural stress indicators. I did the calculations mentally one more time, and then I made a decision that went against every instinct, against every rule I'd learned. Daniel, I'm going to increase the descent rate to 6,000 feet per minute. He looked at me, and even through the oxygen masks I could see the doubt in his eyes. Captain, that's above operational limits. I know, but we have people dying behind us. Monitor the structural indicators. If anything enters the red zone, you tell me immediately. I pushed the yoke a little further forward. The nose of the 737 pitched down at an even steeper angle. The descent rate on the variometer jumped to 6,000 feet per minute. The aircraft began shaking more intensely. I could feel the structure complaining around me, the metal and rivets being tested beyond their designed limits. But it held. Boeing builds its aircraft to withstand much more than normal situations require. I was betting our lives that this safety margin would be enough. This is the most intense story I've ever told here at Black Box. If you're feeling the same adrenaline I felt that day, leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss any story. 15,000 feet. The outside temperature was starting to rise again. The ice on the wings beginning to melt as we descended into denser, warmer air. That was good. Every little advantage counted now. Daniel obsessively monitored the structural indicators, his eyes racing across the panels, looking for any sign that the aircraft was about to disintegrate around us. 12,000 feet! We were almost there. Almost at the altitude where people could breathe again, where the air would contain enough oxygen to keep a human being conscious. But almost didn't save lives. Only there saved. The turbulence worsened as we passed through a layer of atmospheric instability. The aircraft shook violently, throwing us against our seatbelts. I heard a muffled scream coming from the passenger cabin through the closed door. I imagined unconscious bodies being thrown against seats, people unable to protect themselves, but I couldn't slow down. Not now. Not when we were so close. 10,000 feet! The magic altitude. The altitude where the air is dense enough, where there's enough oxygen. But I didn't reduce the descent yet. I wanted to get lower, wanted to guarantee that even the weakest lungs, even the smallest children, would have enough air to breathe. I continued descending to 8,000 feet before finally beginning to level the aircraft. It was one of the most delicate moments of the entire flight. After diving for almost 6 minutes in an emergency descent, I needed to gently bring the aircraft back to level flight without causing more structural stress. I pulled the yoke gradually, feeling the 737 respond, the nose rising slowly, the descent rate decreasing. 5,000 feet per minute, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000, 500, 0. We were level at 8,000 feet. It had taken 6 minutes and 20 seconds since the initial depressurization. 380 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Sandra, sitrep, I asked, using military jargon for situation report. I needed to know what was happening back there. There was a moment of silence that seemed to last an eternity. Then her voice came back, shaky but functional. People are starting to wake up, Captain. There are still a lot of unconscious people, but I'm seeing movement, breathing. They're coming back. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. They were coming back, not all maybe, but they were coming back. For a brief and glorious moment, I allowed myself to feel a flash of hope. But the flight was far from over. I still had to get that plane on the ground, still had to land with a potentially compromised fuselage, with systems that could fail at any moment. Daniel was already giving me the coordinates of the military airport, and I turned the aircraft in that direction. Control, this is emergency flight. We're stabilized at 8,000 feet, proceeding to military airport as authorized. We have multiple passengers who lost consciousness due to lack of oxygen. We're going to need all available ambulances in the area. The controller's voice came calm and professional, but I could detect the tension behind it. Copied. Emergency services are mobilized. Runway clear for your landing. Winds from the north, 10 knots. You're cleared for direct approach. I began slowing the aircraft, configuring the flaps for approach. Every movement was deliberate, testing the systems, checking if the emergency descent had caused any damage that could affect our ability to land safely. So far, everything seemed to be working. The controls responded normally, the engines were stable. The landing gear, when I extended it, came out and locked in position without problems. Daniel was beside me, checking and rechecking every step of the landing procedure, serving as my redundancy, my backup. It was the kind of teamwork that only comes with rigorous training and mutual trust. At that moment, I had immense gratitude for having a competent co-pilot by my side. The military runway appeared ahead, a long, straight strip of concrete surrounded by green. I could see the flashing lights of ambulances already positioned along the taxiway, a row of emergency vehicles waiting for us. It was comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting because it meant help was available. Terrifying because it was a visual reminder of how serious our situation really was. The approach was smooth. I kept the aircraft stable, compensating for crosswind, aligning perfectly with the runway centerline. At 500 feet altitude, the systems announced 500. At 100 feet, I heard 100. And then I felt the main wheels touch the concrete with a slight bounce, followed by the nose gear lowering gently. I applied the brakes and reversers, and the 737 decelerated docilely, obediently, as if it knew it had just saved 289 lives. Taxiing to the designated position was almost automatic. My muscles knew what to do, even while my mind was still processing everything that had happened. I stopped the aircraft, shut down the engines, and for a moment just sat there, hands still on the yoke, shaking with adrenaline and relief. "Good work, Daniel," I managed to say, my voice coming out hoarser than I expected. "You saved them all, Captain," he replied, and there was genuine admiration in his voice, but I wasn't sure if I had saved them all. I removed my oxygen mask and stood up, feeling my legs wobbly beneath me. I opened the cockpit door and stepped out into the passenger cabin. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. People were slowly waking up, confused, disoriented. Many were still unconscious, slumped in seats or on the floor of the aisles. The flight attendants, silent heroes of this entire story, were moving among the passengers, checking vital signs, comforting those who were waking up frightened. Sandra came to me, and even in the chaos, I could see tears in her eyes. "We did what we could, Captain," she said, and her voice broke a little. The doors were opened, and paramedics flooded the aircraft like a green wave of uniforms and medical equipment. Stretchers appeared, oxygen was administered, people were triaged and categorized by severity. I stood there, in the middle of the aisle, feeling completely useless now that my part was done. It took almost 2 hours to evacuate all the passengers from the aircraft. Some walked out, dazed but essentially unharmed. Others were carried on stretchers, still unconscious. 47 people, I learned later, had to be hospitalized, most for severe hypoxia, some for injuries caused during depressurization or the turbulence of the descent. 3 small children were in critical condition for some time, but no one died. Of the 289 passengers and 11 crew members on board, all 300 survived that flight. The subsequent investigation revealed that the depressurization had been caused by a catastrophic failure in one of the service doors. An unlikely combination of material wear and maintenance error had created a weakness in the seal that finally gave way at cruising altitude. As for the passenger oxygen system, they discovered that a short circuit caused by the depressurization itself had fried the automatic release system and jammed the manual lever. It was, as the investigators said, an extremely unlikely cascading failure. The kind of thing that shouldn't happen but happened. I spent 6 weeks away from flying after that. Not due to suspension or investigation, but because I needed to. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw those unconscious faces in the cabin, heard Sandra's voice saying, "There are more unconscious people than I can count," felt my hands trembling on the yoke as I pushed the aircraft beyond its limits. When I returned to flying, I was greeted with applause from the crew. Some called me a hero. But I didn't feel like a hero. Heroes are people who make brave choices. I just made the only possible choices. If I had descended slower, strictly following procedures, people would have died. If I hadn't decided to exceed the aircraft's operational limits, people would have died. There was nothing heroic about it. It was pure survival. Impossible decisions made in fractions of seconds. What changed in me wasn't pride or renewed confidence. It was humility. The deep understanding of how fragile the line is between a safe flight and a catastrophe, of how many things need to go right, simultaneously, constantly, for 300 people to be able to fly at 6 miles high and arrive safely at their destination, of how many dedicated professionals, from the engineers who design the aircraft to the mechanics who maintain them, from the controllers who guide us to the crew who serve in the cabin, work together to make aviation the safest means of transportation humanity has ever created. I received 3 letters from passengers on that flight. One from a grandmother who was traveling to meet her first grandchild. She thanked me for ensuring she could hold that baby in her arms. Another from a father who was with his 2 small children, the kids who were in critical condition. He told me his children recovered completely, without permanent damage, and that they drew a plane for me. I still have that drawing framed in my office. The 3rd letter was from a young doctor who was on his way to his first day of work at a hospital in the countryside. He told me that experience of waking up on the floor of the plane not knowing what had happened changed his perspective on the fragility of life, said it made him a better doctor. Want to hear more real stories like this? Subscribe to Black Box and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new episode goes live. Because every story here teaches something about courage, decision-making, and the value of life. I flew for 8 more years after that incident. 8 years of smooth flights, of gentle landings, of passengers who never knew how close they came to disaster on other flights, other days. I retired at 53, not because I was tired of flying, but because I felt I had given everything I could give to the profession. I had saved lives. I had trained new pilots. I had shared my experience to make aviation safer. Today I teach at a flight school. I tell this story to every new class of pilots that comes through, not to scare them, but to prepare them, so they understand that the procedures that seem tedious, the emergencies that seem unlikely, The training that seems repetitive, all of it exists for a reason, because one day, maybe, they're going to be in that cockpit when the impossible happens, and that day what will save them won't be heroism or courage. It will be training, knowledge, and the unwavering will not to give up until the aircraft is on the ground and people are safe. Aviation is a profession where you can spend years, decades even, without ever facing a real emergency. But when it comes, you discover what you're really made of. You discover if all that training was worth it. You discover if you have what it takes to make the hard decisions, to push beyond the limits, to carry the weight of hundreds of lives in your hands and not waver. That June day, I discovered I had it. I'm not perfect. I made mistakes. There were moments of doubt and fear. But when it mattered, when every second counted, I did what needed to be done. And 289 people went home, to their families, to their lives, because I didn't let fear paralyze me. I know some of those passengers carry trauma from that flight. I know some could never fly again, and I carry that responsibility too, the weight of having been part of such a terrifying experience for so many people. But I'd rather carry that weight 1,000 times than carry the weight of not having done enough, of not having tried everything possible. The service door that failed was redesigned. The oxygen systems of all 737-800s in the fleet were checked and modified to add redundancies. New procedures were implemented to deal with depressurization, combined with oxygen failure. My flight, my 22 minutes of absolute terror, contributed to making aviation safer for all the flights that would come after. And in the end, maybe that's what matters most. Not individual heroism, not moments of glory or recognition, but the collective contribution to a system that protects millions of lives every day. Every safe flight is the result of thousands of people doing their job perfectly, and every emergency, when handled properly, makes the next flights a little safer. I still dream about that day sometimes. I wake up with my heart racing, feeling the weight of the oxygen mask on my face, hearing the depressurization alarm echoing in my ears. But they're not nightmares. They're memories. Memories of the day I was tested to the limit and didn't break. Of the day hundreds of families didn't have to receive the worst news of their lives. Of the day training, experience, and a pinch of luck combined to write a happy ending to a story that could have ended in tragedy. The 3 children who were in critical condition recovered completely. One of them, I learned years later, became a pilot. She sought me out when she was doing her training, said she wanted to shake the hand of the man who saved her life when she was 5 years old, said she didn't remember the flight, but that the story her parents told inspired her to want to make a difference, to want to be someone who protected other people. So I shook her hand and felt a circle completing itself. This is the real legacy of that day. Not headlines, not recognition, but lives that continued, that flourished, that maybe one day will save other lives. Aviation is like that, a chain of knowledge and care that extends through generations, each pilot learning from those who came before, each successful emergency teaching lessons for future ones. I'm grateful to have lived to tell this story, grateful for the 300 human beings who trusted their lives to me that day and who left that plane, all of them, still breathing. Grateful for the incredible team that was with me, especially Sandra and the flight attendants, who made impossible choices about who to try to save first. Grateful for Daniel, who kept calm and supported me when I needed to exceed the limits of what was considered safe. Grateful for the Boeing engineers who built an aircraft strong enough to survive what I put it through that day. Every flight we take is a miracle of engineering, coordination, and human trust. We hope we never have to test those systems to the limit. But when we do, it's comforting to know they were built by people who understood that lives depended on every bolt, every check, every procedure. We're not alone up there. We carry with us the accumulated knowledge of decades of aviation, the lessons learned from past tragedies, the collective commitment to making the sky a safe place. Someday, you might be on a flight where something goes wrong. It might be something small, it might be something big. But I want you to know that the person in command of that aircraft is there because they went through years of training for exactly those moments. That behind that closed cockpit door, there's someone willing to do whatever it takes to bring you safely to the ground. That you're not just trusting one person, but an entire system of dedicated professionals who put your safety above everything. 22 minutes. That's how long it lasted between depressurization and the moment I put the wheels on the ground at that military airport. 22 minutes that changed 300 lives forever, including mine. 22 minutes that taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. That heroism isn't doing something extraordinary, but doing what's necessary when it's necessary. And if there's one lesson I want you to take from this story, it's this. In the most desperate situations, when everything seems lost, when the impossible is happening, don't give up. Keep fighting, keep making decisions. Keep taking the next right step, and then the next and the next, until there are no more next steps to take, because sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to transform a certain tragedy into an unlikely miracle. All those 289 people got off that plane. All of them had the chance to see one more sunset, to hug their families, to live their lives. And if I do nothing else for the rest of my life, I know I did something that mattered, something that justified every hour of training, every sacrifice, every moment away from home. I saved lives. And in the end, there's no greater reward than that. 22 minutes, 440 seconds, an eternity and a blink of an eye. The time that separates life from death when you're at 37,000 feet with 289 souls under your responsibility. The time in which I discovered who I really was when all layers of comfort and routine were stripped away. I was a pilot, and that day, I did my job. And sometimes I wonder, on those quiet nights when sleep doesn't come easy, how many other pilots are up there right now, flying smooth flights, not knowing that maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a decade, they're going to face their own 22 minutes, their own moments of truth. And I pray that when that moment comes, they'll be ready, that their training will sustain them, that their courage won't fail, that their decisions will save lives. Because that's what we do, that's why we're there. Not for the calm days, not for the smooth landings in clear skies, but for that one flight in a million where everything goes wrong, and we're the only thing between hundreds of people and disaster. And when that day comes, we hope to be equal to the responsibility we chose to carry when we decided to become pilots. I was equal to it that day, and that, more than any medal, more than any recognition, more than any title, is what allows me to sleep at night, knowing that when I was tested, when there was no more margin for error, when every decision was literally life or death, I didn't fail. I did what needed to be done, and 289 people are still alive because of it. Can you imagine what it would be like to be on that plane, maybe as a passenger, maybe as crew, in those 22 minutes where everything hung by a thread? When every second was a battle against time and physics, where the difference between surviving and not surviving was measured in decisions made in fractions of seconds. There are moments in life where we discover what we're really made of. For me, that was one of them. And I discovered I was made of something stronger than I imagined. We all are. We just need that moment to discover it. If these stories from the skies touch you like they touch me, if you want to continue hearing true accounts from pilots who faced the impossible and lived to tell about it, then you know what to do. Subscribe to Black Box, because every story here is a piece of truth, a fragment of human experience in the most extreme situations, and there's much more to come.